Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to U.S. History Through Film. As today we look at the election of 1860, which leads to the U.S. Civil War. Now in 1860, the Democratic Party was split. Northern Democrats still wanted to hold the country together and hoped to serve as a national level party, as opposed to the Republicans who only represented the North. And so kind of the mainstream Democratic Party nominated or wanted to nominate Stephen Douglas from Illinois to run for the presidency. But Southern fire eaters, wanting to defend slavery at all costs, hated Douglas because he had not supported the expansion of slavery into Kansas strongly enough. And so they wanted to nominate an outright Southerner. And so at the Democratic Convention in Charleston, Southern delegates walked out, ending the nomination or the convention before they could nominate a candidate. They met a couple weeks later in Baltimore. The Northern Democrats did nominate Stephen Douglas, but Southern Democrats, meeting separately, nominated John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky. And there was another group too, besides the Democrats, who couldn't hold things together any longer, and the Republicans, who were a purely Northern party. There were some former Whigs, mostly Southerners, but some Northerners too, who couldn't stand the idea of being Democrats, but at the same time weren't quite ready to be Republicans, again, especially in the South. And so they formed a new party they called the Constitutional Union Party, again, hoping to hold the Union together, as they put it, under the rules of the Constitution, which protected slavery without ever actually mentioning the word slavery. And this Constitutional Union Party chose John Bell from Tennessee to run for the presidency for their party. Now, at the Republican convention held in Chicago in 1860, most people figured the Republicans would nominate William Henry Seward. He was probably the most prominent Republican at the time, and he'd been criticizing slavery for 10 years. But some people thought he'd gone too far. He'd said at one point there was a higher law than the Constitution, that being God's law. And so if God's law condemned slavery, then the parts of the Constitution that protected slavery ought to be overturned or ignored. And even for Republicans who were basically anti-slavery, saying there's a higher law than the Constitution was maybe a little bit too far. And Seward did want to completely abolish slavery. Officially, the Republican Party was still a free soil party, meaning they wanted to keep any new states from allowing slavery, but they weren't going to try to end it where it existed. They didn't like it, but they did agree the Constitution protected it, at least officially. So there were several other possible candidates for the presidency, each one representing a different part of the country or some different faction in the Republican Party. But because each stood for some region of the country or some particular faction, it also meant they were offensive to other regions or other factions. Until finally they picked a compromise candidate, one who hadn't been many people's first choice, but who was seen as fairly moderate and fairly uncontroversial, that being Abraham Lincoln. Although later on, he put many of his rivals, most of the other leading candidates for the nomination, in his cabinet, both so he could use their talents and so he could keep an eye on them and hopefully keep them from plotting against him, as some did anyway. And officially, the Republican Party's platform was free soil, free labor, free men. Although they don't like slavery and they want to keep it out of any new states, they promise not to interfere with slavery where it exists, at least officially. But there were some Republicans who definitely did want complete and immediate abolition. And even though Lincoln said that wasn't his point of view, that he wouldn't threaten slavery where it existed, most Southerners figured he was lying, and if elected, he would try to end slavery, or some other Republican might later on. As the election of 1860 really split the country. Here we have a pretty good image of the election, although it can be a little hard to pick out who some of these guys are supposed to be today. Here we have trying to tear the South away from the Union, Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat. Here, fighting over their home state of Illinois, we have Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat. Way over here, John Bell, trying to glue the Union together, although apparently not having too much luck. Again, Lincoln was not even on the ballot in most Southern states. If you were a Southerner who wanted to vote for Lincoln, you're pretty much out of luck unless you lived in Missouri or Maryland. If you're curious, Washington County voted for Breckinridge. To my surprise, I figured it would have been Bell, as we tended to vote Whig in East Tennessee, but not in 1860. So, although Lincoln only got about 40% of the popular vote, it was so concentrated in the North, and the North was so much more populous. With less than 40% of the popular vote, he got 180 electoral votes, well over half. Stephen Douglas came in second in the popular vote, but he was the only candidate who really had a lot of support around the country, so his support was all spread out. Although he was second in the popular vote, he was fourth in the Electoral College, with just 12 votes. Breckinridge came in third in the popular vote, but second in the Electoral College, as you can see, carrying a lot of the South. Bell carried some slave-owning states in the upper South, Tennessee, his home state, plus Virginia and Kentucky. In states where slavery existed and was fairly important, but where there was a smaller percentage of the population enslaved than most other southern states. Again, even though Lincoln said he had no plans to attack slavery where it existed, a lot of Southerners didn't believe him. And this electoral map really scared a lot of Southerners. And Lincoln had won the election without a single Southern vote. I think he got one county in Missouri. And so for Southerners, this meant that even if Lincoln never did interfere with slavery, some future Republican might get elected president with no Southern support and might try to end slavery. And there were certainly other issues too, about the tariff, about government spending on railroads, and other topics. But slavery was the most pressing issue. And so, Lincoln's been elected, but in those days, the president wasn't sworn in until March 4th. Today, he's sworn in January 20th. But back when travel and communication were slower, they gave a longer gap between Election Day and Inauguration Day. So it's about 4 months between his election and being sworn in as president. And in that time, things started to go wrong. Or I guess to get worse, things have been going wrong the entire 1850s. So he was elected in November. December 20th, at 1:15 in the afternoon, South Carolina declared that that state was independent from the rest of the United States. In fact, borrowing pretty heavy from the language of the Declaration of Independence from 1776. South Carolina argued they had always been a free and independent state, only allied with the other United States as long as it was to their benefit to be part of that union. But if the union's a danger to them, the union has to be dissolved. And Lincoln hasn't been sworn in as president yet. The president is James Buchanan. And in the face of a state leaving the Union, President Buchanan did nothing. And there's almost 3 months to go till Lincoln's sworn in. And that long period, 6 more southern states seceded. In order, if you're curious, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana all left in January. Texas left in February of 1861. So 7 slave-owning states left the Union, although for the moment 8 slave-owning states remained as part of the Union. Although the 7 who left were the 7 who had the highest percentage of their population enslaved. And having left the Union, these 7 states had to decide what to do. And so representatives from those states met in Montgomery, Alabama, in February of 1861 to create a temporary government for what they called the Confederate States of America, which they saw as leading a second American Revolution. You can see George Washington is in the center of the seal of the Confederate States of America, and they saw this as another war for independence. with Southern heroes like the original war for American independence. They chose as their president Jefferson Davis from Mississippi, who'd been a hero in the Mexican-American War and had served in the Senate and in the cabinet as well. In the face of a whole new government being created in his backyard, President Buchanan did nothing. He said it was unconstitutional for the southern states to leave, but it wasn't constitutional for him to do anything about it. And in fact, both sides were kind of waiting to see what the other would do. In fact, while the South was theoretically independent, the U.S. Post Office continued to deliver mail in the South because the Post Office wasn't going to accept them as a separate country as long as they bought their stamps. The South insisted all we want is to be left alone. Lincoln insisted he wants to keep the Union together, but says he doesn't want to use force. He's afraid if he brings in the army, that might cause more states to panic and leave the Union. And he worried that while a lot of Northerners didn't really want to see the South break away, at the same time they might not want to fight and die to keep them in the Union. Lincoln, though, did say he would defend all federal institutions in the South still held by the U.S. Army, because there were lots of U.S. military bases throughout the South, a number of Army bases, a number of naval bases along the coast. Most of those had already been occupied by the South, as a lot of Army officers and some Navy officers, although not many Navy officers, who came from the South had switched sides to join the new Southern Army and turned over the bases they were in command of. But there were 4 left, 3 in Florida, and most famously, Fort Sumter in the middle of Charleston Harbor, right in the middle of South Carolina's major port. And of course, South Carolina was kind of the leader of secession. Lincoln said he's going to hang on to these forts the U.S. Army still holds. And Fort Sumter being the most important symbolically, and also just in a practical matter, Charleston being one of the South's major ports, they don't want a U.S. Army fort on an island in the middle of the harbor. Fort Sumter was commanded by Major Robert Anderson, who was about to run out of supplies. Lincoln announced he would send a ship to resupply Fort Sumter, which put the South in a bind now. If they let Sumter be resupplied, then the United States flag stays in Charleston. The South's most important Atlantic port could be blockaded, but if the South attacks, the South will be the ones who have started the war. They had an emergency meeting in Montgomery, Alabama. The Confederate government finally said that they had to act. And even though Anderson had admitted he was about to run out of supplies and would have to surrender soon, the Confederate government decided they had to capture Fort Sumter anyway, and to control all of Charleston, South Carolina. So, starting at 4:30 in the morning, April 12th, 1861, Confederate General Pierre Beauregard began firing on Fort Sumter, which fired back for 34 hours. A day and a half in which nobody was killed, at least during the battle. Anderson surrendered the fort, and the war had begun. Now, as a sign of respect to the surrendering soldiers at Fort Sumter, including Major Anderson, who had been General Beauregard's instructor back at West Point, Fort Sumter was allowed to fire a 100-cannon salute as they lowered the U.S. flag. During the salute, one of the cannons misfired and blew up. So more men were killed lowering the flag than were killed in the whole battle. But the war started, and Lincoln's plan had worked. He had pushed the South into firing the first shot. And now the North, which might have reluctantly allowed the South to go, was furious. And on April 15th, just a couple days later, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to join the Army. The U.S. Army was pretty small most of the time. It had been felt during the Revolution that a standing army was a tool for tyrants. Plus, it's expensive. So the United States usually didn't have a very big army. We didn't want to spend the money on it. Plus, with the Civil War beginning and many Southern soldiers quitting the U.S. Army, it was getting even smaller. There's also no draft. So if we want a bigger army, we have to call for volunteers, and Lincoln did. 75,000 men to put down the rebellion by force, which infuriated the South, who felt they were about to be invaded. And in particular, this offended what are sometimes called the border states, which is to say those slave-owning states that had not yet left the Union. And now all of them started to rethink that. On April 17th, so just a few days after Fort Sumter, Virginia seceded. And the Confederate capital moved from Alabama to Richmond, Virginia, less than 100 miles away from Washington, D.C. In May, North Carolina and Arkansas followed Virginia out of the Union. And in June 8th, Tennessee did so too. Tennessee had a vote early in the year on possibly leaving the Union and had chosen to stay. Most of West Tennessee and Sullivan County, for some reason, supporting leaving the Union, most of Middle and East Tennessee wanting to stay back in February. After Lincoln called for volunteers to invade the South, a lot of Middle Tennessee changed their mind and now supported leaving, most of East Tennessee wanting to stay in the Union. And indeed, in many southern states, poor southern whites didn't particularly want to fight to, as they saw it, prop up the rich slave owners who were tearing the country apart as they saw it. This was particularly true in the Appalachian Mountains, and where a much lower percentage of people owned slaves in other parts of the South. Although there were some places in poor, flat areas, like say northern Alabama, where people didn't want to leave the Union either. Again, fight for the rich slave owners in the capital. The best example, of course, is in western Virginia, which had already been unhappy with Virginia's government for some time, feeling that Virginia's government in Richmond didn't pay much attention to the problems of western Virginia, which are pretty different from eastern Virginia. And now they don't want to leave the Union either. Lincoln sent the army in to support pro-Union people in western Virginia. In 1861, when Virginia voted to leave the Union, they voted to leave Virginia, and were officially made a new state of West Virginia in 1863. And in East Tennessee, there were a lot of people who wanted to do the same thing, but the U.S. Army couldn't get into East Tennessee quickly enough to help people here break off and become a separate state from the rest of Tennessee. And while 4 more slave-owning states left the Union at this point, some, marked in yellow on that map, still chose to stay in the Union, although each of them had people, too, who wanted to break away from the Union, which meant that in a lot of the South, especially the border slave states, which had either reluctantly left the Union or reluctantly stayed in it, you often had kind of a miniature civil war within the bigger civil war, as people within southern states fought over the issue of secession or union, or often just to settle old scores, using that as an excuse to ambush people they didn't like and kill them in the back parts of the mountain. But for many reasons, the war had begun. With Southerners felt the election of Lincoln had forced them to secede to protect their way of life.